third installment of There and Back Again, A Hippie's Tale. My small attempt to make a little more sense of how and when God's people kind of wandered off the road to Shalom, and a little bit of a goal of maybe getting us back on it. I'm Fran Shaka, your tour guide for this journey. I'm also the host of the Road to Shalom podcast. In our last episode, we flew over the decade of the 60s and traced the rise of the counterculture, the civil rights movement, and the drug culture. These three, what we called causes, that emerged from the 50s affluence. And as the 60s were coming to a close, it was the polar opposite of the way the 50s ended. I mean, we had this thing called the system. You remember that? Government, politics, education, church, family, all that sort of stuff. As the 60s were coming to a close, there was disagreement with the system rather than the near total agreement with it of the 50s. There was also disenchantment with life that burst into a visible demonstration rather than the enchantment with life and the resignation to it that we saw in the 50s. And music took a 90-degree turn in the 60s and abandoned the mindless lyrics of rock and roll for the message-laden, heavy content of music we saw, especially in the latter half of the 60s. And the attitude of rebellion that was kind of floating aimlessly in the 50s was replaced by a very active rebellion and a counterculture that became massive as the 60s was wrapping up. And I concluded last time with a couple personal examples of just how the church in Middle America's allegiance to the flag seemed to eclipse its allegiance to the Great Commission and actually caused them to view the counterculture with suspicion and disdain, and actually missed the mission field on its doorstep because of the way we all looked. And just like the church of the 50s sacrificed its biblical worldview, the 60s church sacrificed its credibility, at least in the eyes of my generation. The church and everything associated with it surrendered its place at the table of public discourse, and honestly has been trying to get it back ever since. And this is huge, beloved, because it's going to help us make sense of the efforts made by the church in Middle America in the 70s to recover that credibility that it sacrificed and gave up in the 60s. A similar loss of missed opportunity can be seen with the civil rights movement and the people of color. Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail was penned in response to 8 white clergy who had written him asking him to slow things down and delay his planned demonstrations in Birmingham. And in that now famous letter, King said, "Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that's already alive. We bring it out into the open where it can be seen and dealt with." King didn't want to slow down the momentum that had built. 60 years later, looking back on it, history has demonstrated the truth of his words that he said back then. And it's also clarified how costly it was for people within the white majority culture to stand in solidarity with the oppressed and voiceless people of color in their midst. At the end of the day, I guess what I'm saying is that this decade of the 60s in Middle America wasn't Christianity's finest hour. America almost had a seizure in the 60s as it was coming to a close. They were turbulent days. Nearly 30 years after the 60s closed, Time magazine would label 1968 as the year that severed past from future. You know, the late 60s may have created a mile marker in history, but it fractured countless relationships in the process. Family life in America suffered more casualties than ever before. Annie Gottlieb's comments in her book on the era, Do You Believe in Magic?, are chilling in retrospect. Gottlieb said this: "If the right wing gets to write history, they will put us down not as the love generation, but as the generation that destroyed the American family. They will point to the soaring rates of divorce, venereal disease, teen pregnancy, and abortion as sequelae of the 60s. If they're right in their attribution of blame, then ironically the 60s generation achieved one of our main objectives. We might not have been able to tear down the state, but the family was closer. We could get our hands on it. And like the Confucian Chinese, we believe that the family was the foundation of the state, as well as the collective state of mind. To us, its children, the 50s nuclear family, with its hypocrisies, its covert power struggles, its substitution of materialism for love, was the cornerstone of the nuclear age. We truly believed that the family had to be torn apart to free love, which alone could heal the damage done when the atom was split to release energy. And the first step was to tear ourselves free from our parents. Wow, those are heavy words. Those are battle words, and that's truly what was going on, all right? The parent generation, including my own family, unfortunately, was accused of being shallow and dishonest. We, young generation, boasted of our own depth, our transparency, our honesty, which, in hindsight, I think was simply an excuse for disrespect and vulgarity. And so my parents' generation, they had been raised to work hard and to play fair, not to introspect and pour out their feelings. When you're working 7 days a week, there's not a lot of discretional time to daydream about changing the world. And sadly, for many adults, this inability on their part to talk on the level of feelings with their children made their kids seem like foreign exchange students. You know, at the time, sociologists glibly called this the generation gap, but I think in truth, looking back on it, it was more of a very deep and painful wound. But the family wasn't the only battleground. I mean, it seemed like everyone was fighting everywhere about everything. I mean, there was the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and then demonstrators captured the entire nation's attention at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago by chanting, "The whole world is watching," as Mayor Daley's police attacked them. And in May 1970, the Ohio National Guard battled protesters on Kent State University campus, the end of which was 4 dead, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning photo of a girl weeping over the body of a student, shot dead by the Ohio National Guard. You know, that photo became a permanent part of our collective psyche, and it made its way onto the airwaves via a song, Ohio, by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. You probably recognize these lyrics. Tin soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. I was a sophomore in college. Those lyrics were chilling for a 20-year-old. And as the 60s were winding up, they were also falling apart. You know, the counterculture was anything but a cohesive whole. Many whose minds seemed to be clouded with some kind of fog of nostalgia, or are simply just students of the decade, but weren't really there. They seemed to think that all of us living back then were of one mind and soul, that we were all politically informed and militantly active. You know, beloved, that caricature is simply, it's just not true. It's not accurate. I mean, there were centers of protest that easily and repeatedly captured the focus of the media. I mean, there was free speech in Berkeley, California, Oakland, California for the Black Panthers. San Francisco was the center for gay pride. Chicago, Newark, Detroit for race riots. Columbia University for student takeovers. And the University of Wisconsin at Madison for student bombings. And those are just to mention the more obvious ones. You know, young people captured on film in all of those places and spaces had an uncanny sameness. And as a result, the understandable but faulty conclusion was that all American youth were as informed and impassioned about the causes of the 60s as the countercultural kind of stars who appeared nightly on the news. And the larger truth is that the political left and the bulk of the counterculture, popularly known as the hippies, were distant cousins at best. In fact, the whole mess of us was more like the layers of an onion than a billiard ball. At the center, there was kind of this leftist center of rage. Proponents like Faye Stender, Huey Newton, Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, and a bunch of others. They were the movers and shakers who had the camera's eye and therefore the nation's attention during that decade. They wrote the books, they led the marches, they burned their draft cards, and they fought the law. But they were not representative of the entire generation, just a part of it. If you move out from this kind of center of rage, where varying layers like an onion of diminishing commitment to the anti-war and civil rights movements. So why all this confusion? Well, there were some common denominators among all the players, and the two main ones were the countercultural lifestyle, and that would be the drugs, sex, and music, and the countercultural, what I would call the uniform, jeans, t-shirts, long hair. It's like we all got our clothes from the same store, so to speak, but then when we walked out, even though we looked alike, we went different directions for different reasons. And the reasons, beloved, were social, not ideological. I mean, speaking for myself, it's true I thought deeply about life and I journaled about it, my inner struggles, that's true. But I was pretty uneducated when it came to geopolitics and social history. I mean, I shared the spirit of the leftists because that's when I was living. But I wasn't reading Ramparts magazines or the rantings of Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. I was just empty inside. Something was missing in my life and I wanted to talk about it. I mean, a lot of kids my age did too. In fact, actual conversation, beloved, is one of the things I miss most about those days. It happened all the time, everywhere, with all kinds of people. And today, that eerie gray light reflecting off people's faces from their devices while they're sitting across from one another in a restaurant, honestly, it's a source of great discouragement to me. The fading skills of eye contact and genuine curiosity will not be easily recovered by the generations now that know the perfect emoji to use, but don't know how to read body language. Anyway, back then it was okay to have questions, and it was okay to ask them. You know, when the folk rock group I was part of did warm-up for B.J. Thomas in St. Paul, his repertoire included his hit song, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. We were singing songs about the war. You know, I didn't study Marx, Che Guevara, or Chairman Mao, but I did do drugs, listen to the music of the era, and protest the war. But my solidarity wasn't with the political left. It was with my friends. And my real goal was not to see an improved America as much as filling a void inside myself. I guess at the end of the day, I just wanted to belong to something, and the easiest path to that was doing what everyone else was doing. I know that's a phony commitment when it comes to changing the world, but it was the orbit in which I lived, and to be honest, so did a lot of my friends in the 60s. I think that many of us who lived through the 60s era suffer from a sort of countercultural amnesia when it comes to either the degree or motivation of our involvement in the movement. We sometimes talk about it like we were all in it for the right reasons. The late Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead fame spoke for most of us in Rolling Stone interview in 1989 when he said this: "For me, the lame part of the 60s was the political part, the social part. The real part was the spiritual part." And I think the spiritual part that Garcia is talking about here was the search, the quest for some meaning to life apart from just accumulating stuff. I think most of the 60s generation shared that passion. Matter of fact, one of the reasons for drug experimentation was this longing to try to find some deeper meaning. And in the minds of a growing majority, meaning was personal. It had to be found through experience. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why drugs were such a big part. You know, the austere kind of Spartan image of the leftist radical was much less appealing than the pleasure-seeking lifestyle of the flower child. And so, in short, most of us, partying was preferable to politics. Veteran leftist and self-acclaimed 60s authority Todd Gitlin admitted that there was this kind of house-divided status within our ranks in his book, The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. Here's what Gitlin says. On the verge of the 1967 Summer of Love, many were the radicals and cultural revolutionaries in search of convergence, trying to nudge the new left and the counterculture together, to imagine them as the yin and yang of the same epical transformation. Thanks to the sheer numbers and concentration of youth, the torrent of drugs, the sexual revolution, the traumatic war, the general stampede away from authority, and the trend-spotting media, it was easy to assume that all the styles of revolt and disaffection were spilling together, tributaries into a common torrent of youth and euphoria, life against death, joy over sacrifice, now over later, remaking the whole world. You know, this perception that things were converging was just that, and nothing more, a perception. The sheer numbers of the youthful baby boom created this illusion of unity that just wasn't there. Then, just like today, a highly vocal minority created an illusion of solidarity for the majority, all right? In the minds of most American youth, the war had slowly degenerated from a reality to a cause, moving further and further away from our own world on its way to the netherworld of statistics and talk. Protesting the war had deteriorated from a passion to almost an occupation. Matter of fact, a friend of mine was a student at Berkeley in the 60s, and his comments on this would be comical if they weren't so tragic. He had to drive past the California Highway Patrol post in Oakland every morning on his way to the Berkeley campus. And as he drove by, he saw the patrol cars filing out of the station just like clockwork every morning at 8 a.m. And by the time they all reached the Berkeley campus, the demonstrators were just beginning to show up. And almost as if on cue, the TV trucks would pull up about the same time. And what happened next was very, very cinematographic, all right? The protesters protested, the police policed, the TV reporters reported, They all did their job till about 5 in the afternoon when the TV crews went home with their wives and kids. Then a sort of reverse migration occurred after the trucks left. First the protesters would trickle off, then the highway patrol, and this daily routine was as predictable as an episode of The Office. All right. This phenomenon of the spontaneous become routine also had a very detrimental effect. It diminished the sense of passion and belonging for those of us already on the edges of commitment. I mean, people simply do not maintain involvement in issues that are impersonal, vague, or distant. Trying to topple something as unquantifiable as the system or protest a war on the other side of the world seemed noble, but both of those things lacked personal contact and therefore measurable results. They simply weren't sustainable for that reason. And so for those of us on the margins, the movement lost its motion and it would soon lose its meaning. You know, even the reaction to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy in 1968 was affected by this growing apathy. Youthful idealism seemed to stagger under the very real possibility that even if you do get to a position where you can help others, you're going to get shot. That perennial question, what's the point, reared its ugly head. For adult America looking on, there seemed to be a pause, kind of a hiatus in the pandemonium. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, wondering what was next. And they could point to the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon in July of 69 as evidence that we really were moving forward, and that despite all the noise and clamor of the decade previous in the early part and middle part of the 60s, things were starting to look like good old middle America once again. The disruptions on the campuses, though still intense, were diminishing in number. The majority of us seemed to be settling for the hippie lifestyle rather than the activist worldview. This put parents more at ease because although bizarre and equally unconventional, hippies were not as violent as their militant peers. This became the new normal, but it was more normal than things had been for a while. We were optimistic, too. The U.S. was preparing to begin withdrawals from Vietnam. This was huge for us, all right? The Flower Children, whose flag was the peace symbol and whose state flower was cannabis, seemed to be usurping the public eye. Moral uptightness seemed to be weakening as living together and homosexuality began to be recognized as valid alternative lifestyles. Kind of a sense of solidarity seemed to fill the air and the hearts of us youth in Middle America in the counterculture. Suddenly, it seemed as though we really were a bona fide culture, a counterculture, but a culture, not just an anomaly anymore. In the words of rock star Janis Joplin, here's what she said: "There's lots and lots of us, more than anyone ever thought before. We used to think of ourselves like little clumps of weirdos, but now we're a whole new minority group." You know, we were beginning to believe all that riots, sit-ins, marches, and speeches had actually accomplished something of real value and lasting worth. Although we had only participated in spirit, even those of us on the fringes wanted to share the spoils of victory. We honestly believed we had hard evidence of our success for all of our noise. In January of 1967, San Francisco's Golden Gate Park was the repository for nearly 10,000 hippies pouring in for what was promoted as the first human be-in. Newsweek magazine covered the event. They wore blowsy furs, fresh flowers, jangling beads, floppy-brimmed hats, even Indian war paint. They waved sticks of burning incense, swirled abstractly designed banners, tooted on fifes and recorders. There under the warm sun, with the faithful, was the whole range of the hippie hierarchy. Poet Allen Ginsberg tried to lead the crowd in a Hare Krishna Swami chant. Timothy Leary, headmaster of the LSD school, delivered a plea to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And Pigpen, the pop organist, whose gaudy sweatshirts had become standard apparel for hundreds of teenage girls, invoked the hippies via another favorite idiom, rock music. This human being was a caricature of what the counterculture itself had actually turned into, an altruistic stew of non-political politics, naive idealism, Eastern mysticism, drugs, sex, and rock and roll. 67 was also the year of the famous Summer of Love in the same city. In the words of Todd Gitlin, here's what he said: "Over 50 or 75,000 young pilgrims poured into the Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love. but they were at the center of the nation's fantasy life. Music, dress, language, sex, and intoxicant habits changed with breathtaking speed. This flowering optimism was clear in the lyrics of a very popular hit song about the same events entitled San Francisco by Scott McKenzie, which came out that same year. Here's what Scott McKenzie sang. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. If you're going to San Francisco, you're going to meet some gentle people there. All across the nation, such a strong vibration. There's a whole generation with a new explanation. That's him singing about us and all of our idealistic hopefulness. All right. And then finally, if we just want to cap off the year's achievements, in October 21st of 67, during the March on the Pentagon, a group made a seemingly serious effort to exorcise the demons of war and death by trying, I'm not joking, by trying to levitate the world's largest office building, the Pentagon. Now, just for the record, it didn't. Levitate, that is. All right. If what happened in Golden Gate Park and Haight-Ashbury was tangible evidence of the reality and permanence of the counterculture, then what was to occur 2 years later on the other side of the continent seemed to prove beyond any reasonable doubt, well, at least for 6 months, that a new age was about to dawn. In August of 1969, 400,000 card-carrying members of the counterculture converged on a dairy farm owned by Max Yasker in Bethel, New York, for what was billed as the Woodstock Music and Art Fair and Aquarian Exposition, now known forever simply as Woodstock. Today, just say the word and people have flashes of nostalgia. If you talk to anyone in the baby boom generation, they'll know of Woodstock. We honestly saw it as an apologetic for the reality and the permanence of the counterculture. We were real. We were here. We are the world. The optimism that inflated the significance of Woodstock was nearly universal among the counterculture near the close of the 60s. And, as always, our optimism was best reflected in music. Aquarius, the theme song from the rock musical Hair, which was made popular by the rock group Fifth Dimension, actually captured all of it. I'm sure these lyrics are familiar to you, but I want you to listen to them again, maybe for the first time in the larger context of what we've been looking at in terms of their own historical context. Here's the lyrics. When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, the age of Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding. No more falsehoods or derisions, golden living, dreams of visions, mystic, crystal revelation, and the mind's true liberation. Aquarius. Or how about this prediction by folk singer Arlo Guthrie in a Newsweek magazine interview? He said this, all political systems are on the way out. We're finally going to get to the point where there's no more bigotry or war or greed. Peace is on the way. Get this now. I want you to listen to this next statement. People are simply going to learn that they can get more by being groovy than by being greedy. Now, pay no attention to the contradiction about getting more and greed and groovy in those lyrics. Arlo was only 22 years old when he wrote them, so you got to cut the guy some slack. All right, about the same time, there's Carole King's song, Beautiful. You've got to get up every morning with a smile on your face and show the world all the love in your heart. Or 1967, how about these lyrics? All you need is love. Love is all you need by the Beatles. Okay, so we believe that a new age was dawning. It was the inevitable fruit of all the love we had generated. We really thought that after the smoke cleared, the country would see clearly that we knew what we were talking about. The counterculture would become the accepted culture. We believed that we were the true architects of the great society. Our children and our grandchildren would be the beneficiaries of our blood, sweat, and tears. We would be heroes. No, it's indisputably true that our children and grandchildren did inherit the fruit of our labors, but we never could have imagined what a foul harvest that was going to be. The decade that almost destroyed a nation was coming to a close, and the nation's youth held their breath and waited. Maybe we were going back to the best of times once more. There was this sort of hiatus in the rebellion and a spirit of jubilation in the music. But if illusion is the parent of disillusion, then despair is the grandchild. The darkest days were just ahead, just around the corner, and unfortunately just out of sight. From the time I entered college till the time I left, the Aquarian dream had turned into a nightmare. We were like modern-day children of Job. The roof of our house caved in on us while we were at the height of our own party. The glowing optimism of the latter part of the 60s turned into a pessimism of the darkest shade by the time the 70s were underway. Beloved, you could cut it with a knife. It was that real. A mournful cry of the soul permeated the youth culture. Music, at least a whole lot of it, was more of a lament than a lark. The opening years of the 70s brought with it a chilly wave of hopeless music, much of it sung by the same minstrels who had brought us hope just a few years earlier as the curtain of the 60s was closing. I mean, in 1967, the Beatles were telling us that all you need is love. But in 1973, Paul McCartney was singing with Wings, his new group, because the Beatles were in the midst of a huge conflict and on the road to breakup. And the lyrics from McCartney in 73 are so different. You used to say, live and let live. But if this ever-changing world in which we live in makes you give it a cry, so live and let die. Apparently love wasn't all you needed. And the fifth dimension, the ones who gave us the banner song Aquarius about harmony and understanding and sympathy and trust abounding in the late 60s, had changed their tune too at the same time in the early 70s. Here's what they're singing. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, we'll never be the same. We're all forgiven because we're only living to leave the way we came. I told you that in August of 69, Woodstock was our proof of the solidarity and wisdom of the counterculture. But only 4 months later, beloved, in Altamont, a San Francisco area free concert, stripped that naive optimism naked. The entire counterculture deconstructed that weekend. Matter of fact, listen to Rolling Stone magazine's assessment of Altamont. At the end of their 1969 U.S. tour, the Rolling Stones planned a free concert near San Francisco. It came to be called a festival, and despite the fact that the site was changed less than 24 hours before the show, some 300,000 fans converged on the Altamont Speedway near a freeway about 40 miles southeast of San Francisco. There was no way that basic necessities could be provided for so many people on such short notice. And Altamont turned into a nightmare of drug casualties, stench from toilets and fires, and food and vomit, faulty sound, and finally the brutal violence visited on the audience by pool cue and knife-wielding Hells Angels, who said they had been hired by the Rolling Stones and co-sponsors Grateful Dead for $500 worth of beer. They were hired as security guards. The climax came as the Stones played late in the day when a young black man drew a gun and was knifed repeatedly by the Angels. He died, as 3 others had in the course of the day. Altamont, listen to this, beloved. Listen to this closing statement. Altamont was hailed as the end of the counterculture. More accurately, it was a graphic symbol for what the counterculture had in truth become. You know, the year 1970 witnessed the drug-related deaths of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison from The Doors, as well as an intensely emotional and spiteful breakup of the Beatles. Change came to my own life as well. My own folk rock group disbanded. A sociology professor on my campus who had championed moral relativism as a lifestyle was found dead in her car in the garage, the engine running. Another Marxist sociology professor on my campus who had called the Apostle Paul a bastard and was the leader of a commune lost all of the commune's funds in a pool game at a local bar. My philosophy professor, who had exploited his academic freedom by having a lecture hall full of us chant the F word at the top of our lungs to help us see our, quote, moral hang-ups, was fired for sexual misconduct with co-eds. I spent that summer living in Minneapolis in an area known as the West Bank, a sort of miniature Haight-Ashbury in the Midwest, and I watched my hippie brothers steal each other's drugs, money, and their bedmates. It slowly became evident to me that the brotherhood I thought I was a part of was simply a sham. My wife's countercultural peer group began to unravel before our eyes as well. She started to seriously question the validity and integrity of this movement when her friends sat and laughed as one of them burned his arm with lit cigarettes while high on speed. Others in her world ended up in institutions or in caskets because of drugs or mental problems. Like the rest of us, she watched the countercultural ideology unravel like an old sweater. What had happened? How do you explain the overwhelming evidence that an entire generation appeared to be chronically depressed? Was it merely a cultural hangover after an enormous national party? Or was it something deeper? I quoted author Annie Gottlieb earlier. I want to let you listen to her take on all of this. Here's what Gottlieb says. Like all reactions, the anti-America drew its energy from that which it opposed. When the war ended and Nixon resigned, its necessary destructive work was finished and its energy ebbed. Constructive work would take much longer, and it could not be achieved by the mere amassing of bodies. No can be shouted from a million throats. Yes is said face to face in response to love or reason. The counterculture was only a negative. We just said no to whatever the old America had said yes to. What Gottlieb says about the left applies to the entire 60s youth culture. It was simply a reaction, a youthful knee-jerk, if you want, to what we thought was wrong with middle America. We were critics of the present social order with no sense of responsibility, much less a plan for the new order we were demanding. Tearing America down had been relatively easy. Rebuilding it had never crossed our minds. Never crossed our minds. Former radical Peter Collier, writing to a friend who had accused him of abandoning the leftist cause, informed him that the heart of the political left had nothing to do with construction, only demolition. Listen to this. This is a confession of a former leftist radical in his book, Destructive Generation. Take a careful look at what you still believe, because it is a mirror of the dark center of the radical heart. Not compassion, but resentment. The envious whine of have not and want. Not the longing for justice, but the desire for revenge. Not a quest for peace, but a call to arms. It is war that feeds the true radical passions, which are not altruism and love, but nihilism and hate. The thought that we had any responsibility for, much less complicity in the evils of this system, had never even entered our minds. But by the end of the decade, it began to dawn on us that we had shouted fire only to discover matches in our own hands. We were a part of the problem because we were not part of any solution. This ambiguous relationship of the counterculture with its perceived nemesis, the military-industrial complex of America, is really best exemplified in the industry that helped fuel the 60s rebellion in the first place, and that would be rock music. And the Rolling Stones are an excellent example of our ability to live with paradox. It was easy for Mick Jagger to sing about being a poor boy who had to sing for a living in his 1968 song, Street Fightin' Man. It was easy for him to rail against wealth and affluence, yet he had tons of it himself. Life for him was very comfortable and conveniently profitable. And if being political was the rage, count me in. Stuart Goldman wrote about this artistic disconnect in National Review at the end of the 80s, and he unmasked the true politics underneath all this hypocrisy. Listen to Goldman's statement. So, if rock is neither conservative nor Marxist nor liberal, that leaves the anti-authority doctrine of anarchism. This is nearer the mark. Rockers routinely denounce the system, governments, parents, teachers, etc. However, they usually do this while driving around in limos, talking on cell phones with managers, lawyers, and accountants. Ask any young rocker his dream, and you'll find that it involves wealth, fame, and power. Rock politics, in short, is a sort of parasitic anarchism. Rockers are comfortably aware that the hated system will doubtless outlive them, continuing to provide its despised benefits. At the heavy metal extreme, this becomes a form of hypocritical nihilism in which all the normal values of civilized decency are sneered at and, in everyday business transactions, relied upon. Goldman accused rock activists of dealing from both sides of the deck, taking a few bucks out of your front pocket to give to charity is one way to encourage people to put money in your back pocket. Altruism and philanthropy are easier if the needle of net worth doesn't have to move much. We who identified with the 60s counterculture were parasitic anarchists. I think that's true. And when nearly every institution in the land wilted underneath the shouting masses, we had to face the fact that in a sort of surrealistic twist of events, we were now in the driver's seat. It's easy being a parasite until you kill your host. When we pulled down the walls of authority, the very boundaries that provided some sense of meaning to society, we had no alternative to put in its place. We hadn't considered that we would need a counter system if we were going to be a counterculture. You know, if you erase the lines on a soccer field, it's difficult to resume play until you know where the game is supposed to take place. And this naive ignorance of the complexities of society was a huge part of our youthful idealism. But as the smoke of the era cleared, it became apparent that we were guilty of much more than just rebellion. A lot of the motivation for our actions was blatantly selfish. I'm not proud of that, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks my age that would disagree, all right? But still, at the end of the day, what we sanctified and called, quote, the movement, with its causes, became a justification for throwing off the restraints of the 50s with a warped sense of mission and dignity. All the fun was just a perk for doing what's right. That's what we kind of thought and said. It was a sort of hippie version of the affluence of the 50s. One of the most sobering testimonies to this truth is contained inside the pages of Bob Greene's book, Homecoming. It contains letter after letter from returning Vietnam vets who were spit upon, cursed, and made the targets for flying garbage and soiled diapers. My own brother was one of them. One of his first experiences after spending 6 months in military hospitals recovering from a mortar attack was to be spit in the face by a young co-ed who called him a baby killer. You know, all of this creates the stark realization that the, quote, peace movement was not committed to peace, and surely not to Shalom, the theme of this podcast, but only some idealized notion of peace. And let me push a little harder on that same bruise. Some of the anti-war pathos was simply fear of getting drafted. We had deep feelings for our causes, but we were deaf to accusations of irresponsibility. And this is still true today, beloved. If you read the memoirs of former 60s radicals, you'll be hard-pressed to find anything even remotely resembling remorse. Matter of fact, former radical Tom Hayden, in his autobiography, Reunion, boastfully proclaimed, "We of the 60s accomplished more than most generations in American history." Hayden's statement is definitely true, but one could just as easily say that the bomb dropped in Hiroshima accomplished more than any bomb in history. You know, my generation had played catch with a nation, but by the decade's end, that nation lay shattered like a piece of mishandled china. You know, with the unguarded honesty that permeates the entire book, Destructive Generation, The Recollection of the 60s, Peter Collier and David Horowitz admitted this. The 60s may have been a time of tantalizing glimpses of the New Jerusalem, but it was also a time when the system, that collection of values that provide guidelines for societies as well as individuals, was assaulted and mauled. As one center after another was discredited under the New Left offensive, we radicals claimed that we murdered to create. But while we wanted a revolution, we didn't have a plan. The decade ended with a big bang that made society into a collection of splinter groups, special interest organizations, and newly minted minorities, whose only common belief was that America was guilty and untrustworthy. This is perhaps the enduring legacy of the 60s. You know, I've migrated from uneasiness to disgust to actual anger over the edited and romanticized versions of my era, written and propagated by those who feel no responsibility to try to clean up the debris from our own party. The three generations since, Gen X, the Millennials, and iGeners, inherited the miscarriage of the Aquarian dream. And I'm embarrassed by my own generation's refusal to own our contribution to the dismal moral and spiritual environment our own children and grandchildren are growing up in. We of the 60s need to recognize the consequences of our past actions. They created the near-perfect storm of conditions nearly 50 years ago, the long half-life of which has put the generations since then at extreme risk. The collapse of the 60s social agenda polluted the watershed, out of which 3 streams flowed and grew. 3 paths Middle America traveled on its emotional and intellectual exit from the collateral damage of the decade of illusion, the 60s. And those 3 streams have grown into raging torrents in which the youth of today are struggling to find an anchor. All right, we'll jump back into that water in the next episode when we look at how Middle America and its Christian sector responded to the 60s failure. I'll see you then.